On Friday morning, Michael Flynn pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI while serving as President Trump's national security advisor. Making a false statement to a federal official is a felony offense, but nowhere near as bad as what the special counsel, Robert Mueller, could likely have charged Mr. Flynn with, including charges for possible violations of the Foreign Agents Registration Act similar to those brought against the former Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort and his deputy Rick Gates, those stemming from a possible attempt to kidnap a Turkish cleric in Pennsylvania. By pleading guilty and agreeing to cooperate with Mr. Mueller, Mr. Flynn also appears to have averted prosecution of his son, who was reportedly implicated in some of the misconduct. Prosecutors generally offer favorable plea bargains like this one only when the cooperating defendant can provide evidence that incriminates someone up the ladder, someone more senior than the defendant himself. In our experience, that is particularly true when the prosecutor is deciding not to pursue other, readily provable charges, like those that seem to exist here. Lest there be any doubt about what is happening, the statement of the offense filed along with Mr. Flynn's plea shows that he is prepared to testify that the communications that he lied about concerning conversations with the Russian ambassador in December 2016 were discussed with multiple members of the transition team, including one senior official and one very senior member. It is not yet clear who those individuals are, but transition officials and members included Jared Kushner and Donald Trump Jr., as well as Vice President Mike Pence, Representative Divine Nuns of California, the former White House Chief Strategist Steve Bannon, and Treasury Secretary Stephen Mnuchin. It is probably Mr. Kushner who is in greatest jeopardy now. Bloomberg has reported that he is the very senior transition member who directed Mr. Flynn to reach out to Russia. Mr. Kushner has already been questioned by the special counsel and by Congress. If he was one of those officials Mr. Flynn spoke to and he was not honest about it when questioned, he could face similar false statement charges. Mr. Kushner also failed to disclose approximately 100 foreign contacts on his security clearance application. Each omission is a potential false statement. Mr. Flynn may have information about conversations with Mr. Kushner that would demonstrate that the omissions on Mr. Kushner's form were intentional and therefore criminal. Remember, we do not know everything Mr. Flynn has to say. What was disclosed in the court filings and hearings is probably only the tip of the iceberg. Prosecutors generally keep that to the bare minimum needed for the guilty plea, in order to avoid tipping their hand in their investigation. Donald Trump Jr.'s exposure is also deepened by the Flynn plea, along similar lines as Mr. Kushner. He might or might not be one of the unnamed transition participants Mr. Flynn identified. Moreover, the president's son has been interviewed at length as a part of congressional investigations, and Mr. Flynn's testimony could show he was not candid. Because of Mr. Flynn's role on the campaign as a trusted member of the inner circle, he may also have a great deal to say about topics like Mr. Trump Jr.'s June 2016 meeting with several Russians, Mr. Manafort and Mr. Kushner, or about the Trump science contacts with WikiLeaks. If Mr. Flynn's recollection is not the same as what Trump the Younger told Congress, Don Jr. is in serious trouble. Finally, Mr. Flynn's cooperation could also place Mr. Trump himself in real jeopardy. ABC News has reported that Mr. Flynn will say Mr. Trump directed him to make contact with the Russians. If that is so, it opens a Pandora's box of questions for the president. Is that a reference to the calls about the sanctions, or something else? How many times did Mr. Trump do that? When, and about what? How can we square that with the president's denials of knowledge about the Flynn contact with Sergei Kislyak, the Russian ambassador, or any contact with Russia? The possible answers range from bad to worse to fatal for the president. Whether or not that reporting is borne out, there are a variety of other ways Mr. Flynn could damage the president. Mr. Trump is said to be under investigation for obstruction of justice. That includes allegedly telling the FBI director at the time, James Comey, in an apparent reference to the very conduct to which Mr. Flynn has pleaded guilty. I hope you can see your way clear to letting this go, to letting Flynn go. There is already significant evidence that Mr. Trump obstructed justice, and Mr. Flynn may be able to add to it, for example, by testifying that those efforts came at his request, or by sharing any other relevant conversations he had with the president. Finally, the plea raises the prospect that the president will renew his reported interest in pardoning current or future targets of the investigation, or firing the special counsel. Both would be grave errors. Mr. Trump exposed himself to obstruction of justice liability by exercising his power to fire Mr. Comey for questionable ends. Mr. Trump would incur the same potential liability were he to issue pardons for self-interested or corrupt reasons, and the courts might not recognize their validity. Even lawfully conferred powers wielded by the president cannot be employed corruptly. The same goes for firing Mr. Mueller. The president tried that once with Mr. Comey, and it only landed him in hotter water. If he attempts it now, he will find the temperature boiling.